Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Strategic Labs, the channel where we deeply analyze the ideas, narratives, and strategies behind the documents. We are Sarah and Mark. Today, we are going to dive into the material we have on the table. Before we start, please leave a like, share the episode, subscribe to the channel, and remember to check the description for the links to access the original material.
That's right. And today we're doing a serious deep dive into an incredibly impactful concept. We're looking right at the heart of why some nations absolutely thrive, while others just seem to stumble into this perpetual, endless cycle of crisis.
So, the big question we're tackling today is this. Is the deficit the true root of a nation's decline? Now, to figure this out, our entire analysis in this explainer is based exclusively on Chapter 1 of the book Milei, The Reform Blueprint, 18 Principles for Leaders and Citizens Who Demand Results by Max Basil. And hey, for those of you who want to follow along or dig deeper, you can grab the book on Amazon using the link down in the description. It is such a fascinating read, Mark, because it looks at Javier Milei's recent administration in Argentina as a real-time, incredibly high-stakes case study. And just to be clear up front, we aren't here to take a political side today. Our goal is to impartially break down the mechanics of this framework. And the core thesis we're exploring is actually pretty profound. It argues that a fiscal deficit isn't just a simple budgetary shortfall. It's what the text calls the deficit trap. Think of it like a vicious cycle. When there's a persistent gap between what a government spends and what it actually earns, it fundamentally destroys national sovereignty. So it's really not just a math error you can fix with a quick spreadsheet update. It is a structural pivot that slowly eats away at the social contract.
Exactly. Because when a government constantly relies on short-term, often highly inflationary financing just to keep the lights on and cover its bills, it actively crowds out productive investment. It essentially hands over a country's priorities to its creditors. You literally lose your autonomy. And the crazy part is, the longer a nation stays in this trap, the harder it is to escape. The behaviors that created the deficit in the first place become completely hardwired into the political system.
Which brings us to this genuinely brutal trade-off: short-term political survival versus long-term fiscal discipline. This contradiction is wild. The very leaders who are supposed to fix the deficit face a massive disincentive to actually do it. They are structurally incentivized to overspend. Because think about it, expanding services, adding subsidies, bloating the public payroll, that stuff yields immediate electoral rewards. You win the next election. But the cost? The incredibly difficult austerity required to achieve long-term fiscal discipline, that just gets kicked down the road to the next administration, or honestly, the next generation. Hit the nail on the head, Sarah. The incentive structure is totally backward. Doing the right thing for a nation's long-term survival is, in the short term, basically political suicide. So how does this trap actually sustain itself? Let's break down the institutional mechanics. First, you've got the obvious mismatch between spending and revenue. But that's kept alive by short electoral horizons. Politicians are usually only looking, 2 to 4 years ahead?
Right. And on top of that, you have fragmented accountability. In these massive, complex governments, subnational entities, and different ministries completely diffuse the blame for overspending. It's like a giant shell game. No single person takes the fall. And then you have the absolute most destructive mechanic of all: central bank financing. When governments can't borrow anymore, they just pressure the central bank to print more money. It acts as an invisible tax, and make no mistake, it hits the poorest citizens the hardest.
There's a really striking quote from the text that perfectly sums this up. Short-term populism is rewarded, austerity or reform is punished.
It's a harsh truth, but a necessary observation. The system inherently punishes any politician who dares to try and fix the underlying structural decay. If you attempt to cut spending to save the country's future, the immediate pain means voters will likely just vote you out. So you end up stuck in this stable but incredibly toxic equilibrium. Everyone knows the ship is sinking, but absolutely no one wants to be the one to turn off the music.
Okay, Section 1. The case study. Argentina's 2023 to 2024 fiscal shock. Argentina is pretty much the perfect crucible for testing these ideas. Let's trace how this collapse happened. We're talking about decades of chronic overspending and monetary issuance. This wasn't some sudden overnight crisis. It was a slow, agonizing structural decay.
Which finally boiled over in 2023. It became an existential threat. We're talking collapsing creditworthiness, total public distrust, and inflation that literally spiked into the triple digits, over 200%. At that point, the fiscal imbalance had reached a breaking point where gradualism was completely off the table. This is what forced that radical policy shift in 2024, anchoring the entire recovery strategy on achieving one very specific metric: a primary balance.
Now, you might be wondering, what exactly is a primary balance? just to clarify for everyone, it's a fiscal state where a government's operational revenues cover its expenditures, but explicitly excluding interest payments on past debt.
And that right there is a crucial distinction. By ignoring past debt interest for a second, the primary balance isolates the government's current operational discipline. It answers the question, are you actually living within your means today? Making this specific metric the non-negotiable anchor sent a massive signal to both the markets and the citizens. It basically said the era of deficit financing and all the money printing that fueled it was officially over.
But how they actually achieve that balance is where the real insight lies. The rule in the blueprint is incredibly clear. Cut spending. Don't just raise taxes.
Exactly. Taking a tax-first approach is seen here as a huge distortion. Think about it. If you just hike up taxes to cover your deficit, you dampen investment, you force more people into the informal economy, and you don't actually fix the root of the illness, which is bloated state expenditures. This Argentina case study strongly argues that true sustainable reform relies on immediate expenditure restraint. You literally have to shrink the state's outlays before you can even think about asking citizens to pay more. Otherwise, you're just choking an already fragile economy.
But of course, confronting that short-termism head-on comes with a massive, immediate cost. The text notes, the objective was to restore credibility, stabilize expectations, and reduce external debt dependence by confronting political short-termism directly.
And let's be real about what that cost looks like on the ground. It means immediate, heavy resistance. You're dealing with entrenched bureaucratic actors, powerful public sector unions, and everyday people relying on subsidies. When you cut spending, you are invariably cutting someone's income or their benefits. So the debate here is fascinating and super urgent. How on earth does a leader maintain a credible political mandate while inflicting the very real short-term pain required for the country's long-term survival?
Which leads perfectly into Section 2, Citizen Accountability, Metrics to Measure the Truth. Because how do citizens actually know if the government is genuinely fixing the problem or if they're just using clever accounting tricks? If a population is going to endure the harsh reality of austerity, they need completely transparent tools to verify that their sacrifice is actually shrinking the structural deficit.
So the text highlights two absolutely crucial metrics. First is the primary balance to GDP ratio. Like we discussed, this measures the core operational discipline. Basically, is the government funding its day-to-day operations with its own revenue?
Right. And the second metric is the total deficit to GDP ratio. This one measures the total fiscal burden, so it factors in all that debt service and rollover risk. By religiously tracking these two specific numbers, citizens can completely cut through the partisan noise. It democratizes the whole concept of fiscal reform. You don't need a PhD in economics. If these two numbers are shrinking, the structural deficit is shrinking. If they are growing, the government is failing, period, regardless of whatever PR spin they're putting out. And this is exactly why transparency shifts the equilibrium.
Absolutely. In the Argentina case, the regular, independent publication of these exact fiscal metrics actually increased the political cost of abandoning the reform. When the data is out there in the public eye, undeniable and easy to understand, it becomes so much harder for politicians to quietly slip back into deficit spending just to win favor. Transparency acts as a very real, structural guardrail against falling back into the trap.
Let's move to Section 3, Structural Risks, the fragility of fiscal reform. Because here's the thing, technical targets mean absolutely nothing if the social fabric of the country tears apart in the process. There are very real dangers here. Escaping the deficit trap is an incredibly fragile process. First, you have the immediate political backlash and mass protests. Then, you risk an austerity-induced economic recession as government spending suddenly plummets. That directly leads to rising unemployment.
And we can't forget the entrenched elites, the people who benefited from the old, bloated system. They will actively work to reverse these reforms. Plus, a nation is always vulnerable to external shocks, like sudden swings in commodity prices. We have to be really critical about the human toll here. If you cut the safety nets too fast without careful sequencing, you can easily invite a populist resurgence that sweeps the reformers right out of power, plunging the country straight back into the deficit trap. It is truly walking a tightrope.
So how can other nations learn from this blueprint without falling off that tightrope? The text outlines specific conditions for global replication. Number 1, you must secure a credible political mandate. You need that electoral legitimacy to make the hard choices. Number 2, establish transparent, truly independent audit institutions so the citizens actually trust the data they're seeing. Number 3, And this directly addresses those structural risks we just talked about. You must sequence the reforms carefully to protect the most vulnerable. You can't just slash blindly with a machete, it requires a scalpel. And number 4, maintain consistent, highly strategic communication. The leadership has to constantly, relentlessly explain why the pain is necessary. The best technical targets in the world are absolutely useless without a masterful political strategy to sustain them. Which brings us to perhaps the most definitive message of this whole analysis. Fiscal architecture and political economy are inseparable. You literally cannot fix the math without fixing the politics. Dismantling the deficit trap requires so much more than just balancing a budget on a piece of paper. It demands a complete, ground-up realignment of human incentives. You essentially have to rewrite the rules of the game so that politicians are finally rewarded for fiscal discipline rather than being punished for it. To synthesize the core message today, let's look at this final quote from the text. Breaking the deficit trap ultimately means reshaping political incentives so long-term fiscal responsibility becomes achievable, enforceable, and publicly supported.
And that's really the key takeaway. Argentina serves here not as some flawless, magical miracle, but as a grounded real-world doctrine. It shows the brutal collision of rigorous fiscal math with messy political realism. It proves that a nation's decline isn't just some inevitable fate. It's a technical and political problem that can actually be corrected. But that's only if both the citizens and the leaders are willing to endure the heavy structural surgery required to fix it.
So we want to leave you with this provocative thought to reflect on today. Will your nation demand accountability or surrender to the deficit trap? Are your leaders making the hard, necessary choices for tomorrow, or are they just buying their own political survival for today? We've reached the end of this analysis. If this episode added value to your day, please leave a like, share it, and subscribe to Strategic Labs so we can keep deconstructing narratives. Remember to check the video description. See you in the next analysis.